Hello everyone, this is Ashley Childress with the Statistics Division of ASQ. I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. Our speaker is Scott Lehman, Senior Manager of Quality Engineering and Risk Management at Teleflex. Scott has experience applying quality and statistical principles to research, process and product development, quality and reliability engineering, and risk management in the chemical, bulk plastics, manufacturing, and medical industries. He's currently Senior Manager of Quality Engineering and Risk Management at Teleflex Incorporated in Reading, Pennsylvania. Scott holds a BS and MS degree in Chemical Engineering from Syracuse University. He's a Fellow of the American Society for Quality, past Chair of the Certification Board, and present Chair of the Professional Ethics and Qualifications Committees. Scott is ASQ certified as a Quality Engineer, Reliability Engineer, Manager of Quality, Organizational Excellence, Six Sigma Black Belt, Quality Auditor, and Biomedical Auditor. The title of today's webinar is Risk-Based Statistics for Product Testing. All phones and microphones other than the presenters have been muted, so if you have any questions or comments during the webinar, please use the questions interface that you can see in the GoToWebinar control panel. I'll hold all these questions until the end of the presentation, at which time I will read them to Scott, time permitting. So at this time, I'm going to hand things over to you, Scott. Thanks for presenting with us today.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. I realize that nothing is really free. You're investing your time here, so I hope there will be something of value that you can take away. Today we will go over some ways to answer the common question, how many do I need to test? This presentation uses product risk analyses as the basis for determining sample sizes, with the emphasis on the types of testing done for new product development. I come from the medical device industry, but the general principles in this presentation can be applied anywhere. My organization is Teleflex, a medical device company that has grown through acquisitions and the introduction of new products over the last several years. We are a great place to work. We're organized into business units with each one having their own products and strategies, and just look us up if you want to find out more about this company. In the business unit I work in, called Vascular, we sell medical device kits centered around a catheter of some type. It could be central venous, peripherally inserted, dialysis, epidural, or others. We provide everything that the clinician needs to install the catheter and complete the medical procedure. Some of the kit components are metal, some plastic, some combination. Some components are purchased while others are manufactured. Our kit is shown in this slide here. It typically includes scalpels, syringes, drapes, gloves, sutures, everything you need to complete a medical procedure. And this is the context that I'm working in regarding risk management and the use of statistics. The treatment of product risk can be complicated, so I'm going to get into some of the tools we use for risk management before talking about statistics. So this is how the talk is organized. The first two sections provide the background to apply risk-based statistics in the last two sections. And we're limiting the scope today to design control product testing. We also do risk-based testing for process validation, but that's another whole presentation. So starting with risk. My job as a manager of risk is very challenging and can be the subject of jokes, most with a hint of truth. One of the challenges with implementing and maintaining a risk management program is that everyone intuitively applies risk principles to all parts of their lives, health risk, financial risk, relationship risk, and so on. Therefore, everyone is an expert in their own mind, and everyone does have valid opinions. Simply, risk has to do with two things. how bad an effect could possibly happen, which is severity, and how likely it is to happen, which is probability. We might be able to take chances with a high risk that is very unlikely to happen, and we may accept a low risk at a much higher probability of occurrence than a high risk. There is much that can be said about an overall risk management program, but in order to get into statistics as soon as possible, let's focus directly on the various risk analysis tools that may be used in an organization. This tree that you're looking at is a nice way to portray the situation. In the medical device industry, we use a top-level hazard analysis to directly study the potential causes of patient harm. We supplement that with the fault tree analysis at times. And then we also use various types of failure mode and effects analyses for design, usability, and process. All of the risk analyses are linked through inputs and outputs. During design control, engineers progress sequentially from the hazard analysis and fault tree analysis to the design and usability FMEAs, and ultimately to the process FMEA. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus on the hazard analysis and the types of ratings for risk that come out of that specific type of analysis. If your company doesn't have a top-level hazard analysis and you're not in the medical device industry, for example, the principles that apply in this presentation can be adapted for different types of risk analysis, just as long as they're risk-based. So here is part, but not all, of a typical hazard analysis table. This table has just what we need to talk about the statistics that are going to be applied. So once a hazardous situation is identified, it is evaluated with respect to how serious the harms could be and how likely the causes of the harms could occur. In risk management, a lot of effort is put into identifying and implementing the controls and then re-evaluating what is called the residual risk. What is most important to us today is the severity rating, because that is what is used to determine sample sizes. So here's something I want you to look at for a minute and have it soak in. It's a typical hazard analysis rating scale, and it's a 1 to 5 rating scale. A higher rating is more serious, and the scale is comprehensive, covering everything from nuisance at the low level to death at the highest level. And I've seen a lot of rating scales. Some are 1 to 10, some are 1 to 3. I think 1 to 5 is a nice middle ground. It has the right amount of detail, but enough differentiation between the different levels also. So it's these numbers here that I'll show we can correlate to various sample size determinations in different situations. So we'll move on to part 2, sample size statistics, and build on that risk foundation. Here begins some familiar background material to most ASQ Statistics Division members. When we collect data, it's not possible to test everything for financial, time, or practical reasons, especially in destructive testing, of course. Therefore, a representative sample from all the parts or product is taken. Then we make judgments about the population based on what the sample tells us. Our goal with risk-based testing is to be able to make correct decisions about the population with enough confidence. In order to structure information so that reasonable decisions can be made, the field of statistics uses hypothesis testing. We basically make a statement about the population and then let the data tell us whether or not that statement can be proven false with a certain degree of confidence. The p-value is one of the most important outputs from statistical analysis and is basically 1 minus the confidence level. We do have to address non-normal data in real life quite a bit, and so when you see the confidence and reliability requirements later in this presentation, those requirements also apply to non-normal and transformed distributions as appropriate. So I'll show you how that works later on too. Finishing up some basic statistics, here's the classic decision table that provides the definitions of confidence, power, and types of errors. This is also a reminder that how we are to word our conclusions in statistics. Statements are made with respect to the null hypothesis. We reject it or fail to reject it. We have to be very careful about the language with statistics. Alpha is producer's risk, beta is consumer's risk. Therefore, in the medical device industry, or probably in your industry, the patient, user, consumer, we want them to be protected with a high power of test. So confidence is one thing, but power is also very important. Here's a list of some of the areas where sampling may be used. Sampling is, of course, used in inspection, incoming, in process, and final, but I'm working more on the front end, helping the company design products that you can minimize inspection on later on because they're designed properly. So our focus today is on using sampling more proactively in design and development. And we want to verify and validate to levels that provide assurance that subsequent inspection programs can be minimized. So I just highlighted some of the areas that are going to be touched on in this presentation, skipping over process validation, as I said, and some of the other interesting subjects like test method validation perhaps are for another day also. So how does sample size affect statistics? Here we're in the slide, the equations show a 95% confidence interval for the mean and a 99% confidence interval for the mean. And this just means that we're 95% or 99% confident that the population mean is within these intervals. Increasing the width from the multiplier 2.58 versus 1.96 of the confidence interval makes it more likely that the true population mean is within those intervals. So with respect to risk, where sample size comes in is that if more samples are tested, meaning n increases on the previous slide, then the confidence interval width decreases. The philosophy is that we want to be more confident at higher risk levels. We want to be more certain to protect the consumer also. So in order to be more confident, we test more. My organization, as well as many others, provides tables and quality system procedures to guide sample size determination. So we're going to begin to talk about how these tables are developed now. First, with attribute testing. Attribute or pass-fail testing is simple. This formula applies to 0 failures. All you need to know is what confidence level is desired and what reliability or lot tolerance % effective is allowed. And then at the end, once the sample size can be calculated from this formula, rounding up all fractional numbers ensures that enough are tested. And we could round up further, and in reality, instead of testing 59 in a case like this, we'd probably test 60 because people are used to using round numbers. Confidence and reliability requirements may be demonstrated for any number of failures, provided the sample size is large enough. Calculations for non-zero failure numbers may be more complicated, but are established and straightforward for statisticians to use to create tables for everyone's use. There are many options for sample size calculators for attributes on the internet. So one thing to keep in mind, though, if cost is a consideration, 0 failures is the way to go. You just have no slack, and if you do get a failure in testing, then it really needs to be explained well, or the whole test, all the testing needs to be redone. So variables testing is a little more complicated than for attributes. We need to know desired confidence and power instead of reliability up front. We also need to know what difference is desired to detect with the testing. Minitab and other statistical software packages can perform the calculations as in this example you're looking at. Again, as a service to the organization, statisticians can help develop appropriate tables and put them into quality system procedures. So people don't always have to go into Minitab and do the calculations. So in summary, and before getting into some specifics, when it comes to deciding how many to test, risk is at the top of the list. And many variables follow based on that risk determination. In a business, test time and cost also have to be considerations. Here's another way to review what's been presented so far. Higher risk drives higher required confidence, which drives larger sample sizes. Difference to detect is not as directly tied to risk. It is more of an engineering judgment or based on historical data. Now let's see how this can be applied to a specific type of testing, and I anticipate the next few slides will get into really what you signed up for this webinar for, so it gets into some specifics of application. So we'll start with design verification. In practice, this section can also apply to design validation, and I'd like to show the difference between design verification and design validation because that can be somewhat fuzzy. However, there's a diagram from FDA that can help. This is the classic medical device design model that I'm sure many of you have seen. New product development or improvement begins with identifying what the user or customer wants. Then, in design inputs, the customer needs are translated to requirements. During the design process, outputs are produced, which should be traceable back to the design inputs through verification. Verification answers the question whether the product has been designed right or is planned. Validation is different. It answers the question whether the right product was designed, or does the product trace back to and meet the user needs. So you can see the loops on this diagram go back to different points. For the purposes of this presentation, verification will be considered to be testing that is done in-house, while validation may be external to the organization. Validation can certainly be done in-house too, with representative equipment and models, and that testing should be done too. We shouldn't rely on our customers to validate our products. So for design verification, here's the basic process. Begin with risk, identify the appropriate risk analysis, and then we go through various other steps as we get into the statistics, statistical application of risk. And so I'd like to show some examples with attribute and variable data to demonstrate the differences. As we have seen, attributes are simpler. We start with the risk analysis and get the severity rating of the situation that the testing is related to. Then, as you will see, we can refer to just one table for the sample size. So start with risk, get into statistical tables, do the testing, apply the acceptance criteria, and make decisions about whether the testing passes or fails. So we've seen this table before. Just want to put it up as a reminder. It's a 1 to 5 rating scale in the hazard analysis, because on the next slide I'm going to add one more column to it, and this really gets into the meat of how to use risk to determine sample sizes. So for 0 failures in attribute testing, the column at the right can be developed. The exact confidences and reliabilities are industry and company specific, and ultimately are a matter of judgment rather than regulation. In this example, confidence and reliability levels are in increments of 5, being either 90% or 95% in all cases. Severity ratings of 3, 4, and 5 all deal with serious injuries, so the highest level of confidence and reliability, 95-95, is applied. There's also a distinction between severity ratings of 2 and 1 in terms of higher confidence being required for severity level 2. Because severity level 2 is still an injury, although non-serious, where severity level 1 is just a negligible cosmetic type of defect. So why should 95/95 be the highest level of design verification? There's not a real strong answer for that. It's judgment based. But if we changed to something like 99% reliability with 95% confidence, it would require a much larger sample size of 299. So think about applying these tables in your company. I mean, would the R&D people like to test 59 or 60 of something, or 300? That's a big cost difference for not that much reliability improvement. However, in certain applications, it might be the right thing to do. That's why these tables ultimately are company specific, and they're not a matter of regulation. So here's an example. The minimum force to break the needle between the needle hub and needle tube is 22 newtons for a needle with a nominal outside diameter of 0.5 millimeter. How many needles do we need to test to show that the force to break them is greater than 22 newtons? So we're going to assume we're doing attribute testing at first here, and this will be a straightforward example, as I'm sure you statistics people realize already. All we're doing is counting how many needles pass and how many fail during the testing. Starting with risk, though, we're going to identify the appropriate risk analysis for the needle. And then engineering knowledge tells us that tensile strength is related to the failure mode or hazardous situation of separation from the needle hub. So we go to the risk analysis, we determine that a severity rating of 4 applies to this particular defect. One way to do a hazard analysis is to list all the potential harms, as is done here, and then, to be most conservative, choose the one with the highest severity rating and test to that level. The occurrence rating does not come into the selection of sample size in this case. So the severity level of 4 corresponds to the 95/95 confidence reliability and a sample size of 59. And I just want to mention the term LTPD here, as I did before. This is a common sampling term and is another way to measure how well we protect the consumer. And LTPD is basically the inverse of reliability. 95% reliability is 5% lot tolerance percent defective. So we test 59 and allow 0 failures, and it can be pretty clear cut. None of the samples would be allowed to have a tensile strength less than 22 newtons. So now we're going to turn to the same example, but apply variable testing to it. So it's going to be a little more complicated. For variable testing, we need the same items as for attribute testing, with the addition of power and difference to detect. Acceptance criteria should, of course, be determined prior to testing, but acceptance criteria in this case are not needed to determine the sample size. So that can be kind of counterintuitive to people, so that's an important point to make. We don't need acceptance criteria to begin the testing. Of course, it's best practice to know what your criteria is before the testing, but you don't mathematically need it. So this is just a reminder that with variables, we're looking at our ability to balance and minimize type 1 and type 2 errors. We want to reject the null hypothesis when it is false and accept the null hypothesis when it is true. We want to primarily protect the users of our products while not creating unnecessary scrap and cost to the organization. So it's all about a balance between confidence and power at this point in time. So to begin to determine sample size, rather than going right to confidence and reliability requirements, as with attributes, we must begin with confidence and power, again as they are related to the hazard analysis severity ratings. This example again uses early increments of 5 for confidence and power, with combinations of 95% and 90%. And it doesn't always have to be that way. You could say 99% is the right confidence and or power for your company. You could say 80%. These tables are examples at this point in time just to present the strategy. So this is the confidence and power table. And then there's one more type of table that you haven't seen yet that I'll show now. Once the power is chosen, then the difference to detect is estimated. This difference may be based on historical data if it's available, or on engineering estimates if it's not. In practical usage of this table, most often we use a difference to detect of 0.7 or 1.0. And the table I'm showing here applies only to 95% power, but to confidence levels of both 95% and 90%. So notice the difference in sample size depending upon what power of test is chosen. For example, if you're looking at 0.7 standard deviations, the sample size is 29 for 95% confidence and 24 for 90% confidence. So it's a basic principle that fewer samples are needed for the lower confidence level. However, power also does affect sample size. So I'll show that here. This table applies to 90% power, while the previous one applied to 95% power. And so to demonstrate the effect of using lower power, fewer samples are needed. For example, if you go to 90% confidence and 90% power, 0.7 standard deviations to detect, only 19 samples are needed, whereas 24 were on the previous slide. So in summary, 95-95 would require 29 samples, and 90-90 would require 19. So let's address the same example again using variable data. The first two steps are identical as for attributes. The same risk analysis applies, and we are going to assume the same test method and everything. Is just now we're going to get variable data. Step 3 is also the same as for attributes. The same line item in the hazard analysis applies. I don't need to show that again. The severity rating was 4. But step 4 is where the first difference shows up. In attributes, we went right to 95% confidence and 95% reliability. With variables, we're going to select 95% confidence, 95% power of test. And then here we're going to start doing something different. Difference to detect is sometimes debated. In the end, the testing is going to speak for itself via comparison to the acceptance criteria. But ahead of time, you just don't know sometimes what difference to detect to choose. If you have historical data, that helps immensely. Data that are far above the acceptance criteria will demonstrate the required confidence and reliability, and the power of test becomes less important. But if you're a little closer to the acceptance criteria with the historical data, then you might want to select a smaller difference to detect, requiring more testing. In this case, we're going to choose a difference to detect of 1 standard deviation. So the sample size is 16. And remember, for attribute testing, the comparable sample size was 59. So with variable testing, only about a quarter as many samples are needed, because variable testing gives you so much more information. So this is just a reminder of where the sample size of 16 came from. We choose the confidence 95%, we choose the power 95%, we choose the difference to detect, and the sample size is 16. And again, these tables are just based on mathematical formulas and can be applied to any combination of confidence, power, and difference to detect. I'm just showing how standard tables can be used in quality system procedures if your company wants to do that. Now, for the analysis after the testing, the 16 samples is completed. The acceptance criteria are that for a severity of 4, the required confidence level and reliability values are 95%. So in this case, with 95% confidence and reliability, the tensile strength of the needle should be greater than 22 newtons. And here we get into discussions about, is it best practice to have attribute and variable acceptance criteria the same? And the answer probably is yes. However, that can be challenging since many more samples will need to be tested for attributes, and that increases cost. It's tempting to decrease the confidence reliability requirements for attribute testing. For me, what carries the decision is that why should requirements be less for attribute testing? We should protect the users of our products at a level determined by risk, regardless of the type of data collected. So when possible, challenge your engineers if they think that something has to be an attribute test. Variable data should be collected. It provides more information about the statistical distribution. And if challenged, engineers can be very innovative with testing in order to turn attributes into variables. So it's appropriate to challenge why attribute data is necessary for any particular case. Test methods can be designed and validated, and I'm sure you have very capable engineers that can do that when challenged. So real quick, I'm just going to review through an example to reinforce the concepts. So I'd like to show this another contrast between variable and attribute testing, and then follow with a more real detailed example from experience where we're using some different and enhanced tools. So this time I'm just going to quickly present variable testing first, and this is about verifying an insertion force versus a requirement. If the insertion force is too high, the needle cannot penetrate the patient's body, treatment can be delayed, no serious harm, so the severity rating is 2 on the 1 to 5 scale. And the severity rating of 2 leads us to a 95% confidence, 90% power situation. So then using that confidence, power, and difference to detect, which we're assuming is 1 in this case, the sample size is 13. For a severity of 2, the required confidence level is 95% and the reliability 90%. So in this case, after we do the testing with 95% confidence and 90% reliability, the insertion force should be less than 50 grams. So I kind of raced through that example, but this pretty much summarizes, what the answers are, what questions you need to answer in order to start to do the testing. So 13 samples. Now, instead of insertion force, let's test a similar failure motor hazard, whether the needle is free from defects. And freedom from defects is usually considered attribute testing. That severity rating is also 2. And admittedly, sometimes it's just not possible or feasible to turn attributes into variables. So let's see how many samples would be needed here for attribute testing compared to the 13 that were needed for variable testing. The straightforward sample size determination is from this table and is 29. Confidence and reliability requirements are 95 and 90, and in speaking to LTPD, that's 10%. So notice for attribute testing, we had to go up to 29 samples where we started with 13 for variable testing. And this slide is just a brief summary of what the answers are that we just went through. So with that background, I'd like to go through a more interesting real-life example that uses a little more complicated tools. So this is a study I was personally involved in dealing with the electrical properties of a stylet used to assist in catheter placement. So some of you may be able to relate to this. How often is a quality engineer or statistician asked to analyze data after the fact? They come to us and say, here, analyze this data. Too often. Usually after people realize there is a mess and they don't know what to do with the data. So that's what happened with this example. It turned out the acceptance criteria were chosen, not necessarily based on risk, ahead of time. There are 89 valid data points out of 90 tests, and 5 of those were product failures. 90% confidence and 90% reliability were arbitrarily chosen as the acceptance criteria. So it was, they thought it was planned, but it was really kind of, willy-nilly compared to the rigor that we're trying to go through I'm showing you throughout this presentation. So this is what the initial analysis looked like. Since there were more than 0 failures, the simple formula for a sample size as a function of confidence and reliability does not apply. However, reliability software or beta tables can be used to interpret the results. It was disappointing. There were 5 failures, and if there were only 4, the acceptance criteria would have been met, and maybe they wouldn't have even come to talk to me. But there were 5 failures, and you can't fudge the data. So another thing I wanted to look at, though, and challenge was whether the acceptance criteria were correct and defendable in the first place, and whether variable testing can provide better decision-making information. So in the improved analysis, I want it to be as objective as possible and start from scratch. 2 non-negotiable principles were that the acceptance criteria had to be risk-based and that variable data could be used. Why not? Each of the data points had a number, not just a pass-fail decision. There was nothing that could be done about the sample size or the data itself at this point, but let's see if a statistics person can add value after the fact. So the applicable risk analysis took us to a severity rating of 2 for this failure mode. And the challenge now is that the acceptance criteria changed. It actually became more rigorous, 95% confidence and 90% reliability. However, since variable data provides distributional information, we really don't know what the data are saying until we do the analysis. So it didn't look good at this point in time, but considering we're doing variable testing, we had some hope. So I haven't talked in detail yet about good data analysis practices, but one of the first steps, of course, is to understand the distribution. Data analysis with the normal distribution is often valid and simplest, but the hypothesis of normality itself needs to be tested. So now we're going to follow these steps sequentially: normality test, distribution selection, capability analysis, and tolerance interval analysis. It was clear that the data were not normally distributed, especially due to some very low data points. There are several options for how to proceed with data treatment, and statistical software packages can often be used to quickly explore options. So in distribution analysis, here's a partial output from Minitab. The data did not fit any of the common alternate distributions very well, but the Johnson transformation showed up as promising. So obviously if the p-value is below 0.05, say, we're saying that distribution is not a good fit to the data. More often than not, I've seen the 3-parameter Weibull distribution to be very flexible, but in this case, even that did not work well. So the data were converted using the Johnson transformation. This slide shows the output of a capability study package. Besides the high p-value, the trend charts and histogram passed a subjective visual test for adequacy. So we proceed with the transformed data in a tolerance interval study, which requires normality. So we're transforming the data and doing a tolerance interval study. With the transformed data, here's what the tolerance interval analysis looked like. The output showed that with 95% confidence, more than 90% of the data was above the acceptance criteria. Therefore, despite initial discouragement at the failed attribute analysis, this more detailed variable analysis demonstrated that the data did actually meet risk-based acceptance criteria, and at a higher level than the original attribute testing acceptance criteria was. So now we move on to an entirely different type of analysis. So that concludes the design verification part of this presentation, and we'll look at something totally different with non-parametric statistics. So this section will bring us to the end of the presentation. We're dealing with something called various names and with various purposes. In the medical industry, studies having to do with customer evaluations can be called post-market surveillance or post-market clinical follow-up. The purpose of such studies is to determine if there are any emerging risks that were unanticipated and what design improvements can be made. Such studies also provide information regarding early market acceptance. So here, The importance of the survey drives confidence levels. Risk is not so much determined from the hazard analysis severity, but from the business importance of the decision that you're making and the larger general concern for user safety. So we'll discuss acceptance criteria and analysis. 95% confidence is required for go, no-go decisions, and 90% for internal project direction decisions. In some cases, the lowest level of importance, customer preference again, is being studied. No one's going to get hurt. We're just asking, what do they like? Acceptance criteria in this case are not required, but analysis should be done when possible to make sure the business does not make type 1 or type 2 errors, even with customer preference decisions, because that can affect sales and that kind of thing. Two types of surveys are those that have a numerical rating scale and those that are just yes, no. For the type of analysis that follows, a numerical rating scale must have an odd number of choices, and a yes-no rating scale must have a middle ground. You will see that is because the hypothesis test is set up to evaluate the data versus that middle ground. So this philosophy is purely to analyze data. It's separate from another survey philosophy that I've heard in which an even number of choices is recommended in a survey in order to make people choose one side or the other. Like on a, say, a 1 to 6 rating scale, people have to choose between a 3 and a 4 to get around that middle point. To do the statistics that I'm proposing, you do need a middle point. So here's a simple example question on a 1 to 5 scale. I'm completely satisfied with this product. 1, strongly disagree, through 5, strongly agree. You ask a certain number of people the question, get a certain amount of data, and let's talk about what to do with that then. This is a simple yes-no question with the middle ground option. The analysis is going to be identical as for the 1 to 5 scale, as long as there's a middle ground. So, how do we analyze the results? Many times I have seen survey ratings treated as variable data, with an average and standard deviation reported, and then t-tests are used to determine if differences are statistically significant. That might not be the best idea. With 5-level scale survey data analysis, parametric statistical techniques such as t-tests are not strictly valid because the data are ordinal rather than interval. That means we don't know how much higher a 4 is than a 3 or a 5 is than a 4, etc. All we know is that a 4 is relatively higher than a 3 and 5 is relatively higher than a 4. Besides that fact, we can't assume normality. So again, the t-test is probably not the right tool. So alternatives include non-parametric tests, such as the one-sample Wilcoxon or the one-sample sign. The Wilcoxon test assumes a symmetric distribution of data. However, by the survey structure, the distribution is truncated at the ends. So the assumption of symmetry is highly questionable. So that leaves the one-sample sign test as the preferred technique. The sign test is very simple mathematically and is based solely on the laws of probability and the binomial distribution. So this is the meat of it. This is the hypothesis. Our goal is to reject the null hypothesis. If the goal of rejecting the null hypothesis is achieved, then the alternate hypothesis of the median being larger than 3 is accepted. So let's see an example for how this technique works. So we're administering a survey, collecting data, and let's see what we do with it. Let's say we have this data. 20 1 to 5 scale surveys were administered. And so what can we tell from the results? Let's just eyeball it for a minute. We have 4 5s, 8 4s, 5 3s, 2 2s, 1 1. Are these results acceptable at 95% confidence? It's hard to say. You can't tell with these numbers. So we're going to break it down a little bit more. We're kind of going to do what the statistical software package would do as a first step. We're going to look at how many data points were above, at, and below the test median. Remember, the hypothesis test was the median being 3. So, but even with that information, 12 4s and 5s, 5 3s, 3 1s and 2s, it's still too difficult to tell if the above criteria demonstrate a median above 3 with 95% confidence. So that's why we definitely need the computers to go to the next level. So now for the computer output. Minitab does this analysis nicely. What we were not able to do in our head is calculate the p-value. In this case, since p is less than 0.05, we can reject the null hypothesis with 95% confidence. This is one example, but by trying all combinations, something useful can be developed and used proactively. So I'll show how what I'm talking about with trying all combinations ahead of time and developing a table that is useful now. So as statisticians, we can help the organization by providing this table ahead of time that lists which combinations of results meet the acceptance criteria. In the example that we just did, we had 12 4s and 5s, 5 3s, and 2 1s and 2s. And the relevant row of the table is highlighted here. So this should be an example of results that pass the acceptance criteria. On the other hand, let's say we only had 10 4s and 5s and 7 3s. So not that much different. The acceptance criteria would not have been met. So extending the same principle to a yes, no opinion, no survey. This is mathematically identical. It's treated as a Likert scale survey with 3 levels. We're looking to reject the null hypothesis of the median being less than or equal to no opinion or neutral. So basically we're looking to reject the null hypothesis, and therefore the alternate hypothesis must be true that the median is greater than no opinion, and what's greater than no opinion, it's a yes. So this is a way to statistically show that we're getting enough yeses when we ask a yes-no question. So the acceptance criteria table looks exactly the same as the Likert scale table. Results that pass the acceptance criteria are along the top. If our sample size is only 5, we need all 5 yeses. That's just based on the binomial distribution, so it's pretty simple. And I'm going to have to close there, call it a presentation. The summary slide basically becomes, the outline becomes a summary slide. We covered risk management and statistics as they apply to sample size determination and testing, design verification, and customer evaluations. And we now have a few minutes for questions.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Great presentation. I will, tried to compile all the questions throughout, so I'll try to read through those now. We'll take a few minutes to answer them. One question referred to slide 31, Scott. It was a clarification on the meaning of the term reliability as you spoke about it in your presentation.
Okay. Okay, what's the exact question?
What is the meaning of your term reliability?
Oh, what was the slide number again?
31.
Yeah, 31. Okay.
It says 31. Maybe it meant another slide.
Well, reliability is on 31.
Okay.
So reliability is basically the portion of the population that you can say pass the test. And the confidence level is how confident can you make that statement. So the reliability has to do with more with the number of products, the portion of the distribution in percent that passes a particular test.
Okay, thank you. Another viewer asked the question, they commented that you started with a description of confidence and power, but then switched to confidence and reliability. And what is the relationship between power and reliability, if there is one?
Yeah, there's not a strong relationship between power and reliability for variable testing. For attribute testing, we need to know confidence and reliability up front as acceptance criteria, and then there are formulas that you can use to calculate the sample size. Whereas for variable testing, there's not a formula that you can plug into to get confidence and reliability and have it spit out a sample size. However, there are formulas that can be used that relate confidence, difference to detect, and power of test that can give us a sample size determination. So at that point in time, reliability is not used in the sample size determination, but reliability is used for the acceptance criteria, because when you do the analysis, you still have to determine what percentage of the population is above the acceptance criteria with a certain degree of confidence. So I can't identify a relationship between reliability and power directly in that case.
Okay, thank you. A couple people asked about if 90% or 95% reliability, is that an acceptable rate for your device industry? That sort of failure seems high, especially for medical industry.
Yep, I know what you mean. And we're still debating that within my company, but we have benchmarked other companies, and a 95 highest level does seem to be pretty typical of the major medical device companies. And that's all I can say at that point in time. There are certain types of devices and certain types of failure modes that should be tested at a higher level, and we're building that kind of flexibility into our system to be able to do that. But again, that's not something that can be dictated. It really is a company strategic and business decision. And I agree that if someone said 5% of medical devices were going to fail, that would be too high. So design verification and validation, again, is not the end of things. Process validation is also done, and that provides a higher level of assurance. So it's not like if something fails 5% of the time in design verification and validation, it does not necessarily by any means mean the customer is getting something that's 5% defective. That just wouldn't be the case at all, because process validation is done at a higher level, and then you have the subsequent inspections. With all the controls in place, medical devices fail very little in the field, considering how much they're used.
Okay, thank you. Another person asks about your difference to detect, and they're getting clarification around shouldn't the difference to detect be based on what a minimum medically significant difference is and not just an arbitrary value?
It can be, but if you have a specification, for example, 15 newtons, and you have historical data that all of your products test to be 100 newtons or something like that, that means the difference is so large that you can not test as many and assume a large difference to detect can be used. But if you have a specification of, say, 15 newtons and you have historical data that shows a population with an average of 18, then you probably better test a lot to make sure that you don't get some of those going below 15. So I think it's two different questions, and I'm answering the question about using difference to detect versus a specification, not so much as in test method validation where you're looking at how accurately you're measuring something.
Okay, thank you. Another question, when you brought up your real-world study toward the end, how was the transformed critical value, your pass-fail point, determined?
Well, the specification was also, it had a certain millivoltage, and that was transformed using the Johnson transformation also. So obviously the guidance is if you're using transformed data, you have to transform the specification you're comparing the data to also. So I didn't have time to show the detail, but it's basically using that equation that was shown for the Johnson transformation, plugging in the spec, and then in Minitab doing the capability study of the data versus that transformed specification.
Okay, thank you.
And so we were able to show that the data met the specification in that way.
Okay, great. One question on what is the LTDP again, and how is this term the reverse of confidence level?
Yeah, LTPD is really, I said it was the inverse of reliability, in that reliability and LTPD, both, if you add them together, that adds up to 100%. For example, 95% reliability is the same as 5% lot tolerance percent effective. So the question mentioned confidence, and confidence wasn't what was tied to LTPD, it was reliability.
Okay. Another question, Can you please comment on this sample mix for a survey analysis?
The sample mix.
Yes, is that explanatory enough? That's all the question reads.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that means, but what I was showing, I'll get to it in the presentation, where we're looking at the mix could mean the number of ones, twos, threes, fours, and fives. And the example I showed was just an example to have some data to compare to the acceptance criteria. So the sample mix that's acceptable really depends on how many are tested. So I'll show the table on the screen now. So if you test, say, 5 of something, all 5 of those have to be above the median in order for the acceptance criteria to pass. But if you test 10, then you're allowed to get a certain numbers of 3s and 1s and 2s. And so that's why developing the table using statistical software and the sign test application is good to do ahead of time. So it's in black and white. And you certainly can do the analysis afterwards. If you tested, 32 of something, you could definitely, and you have a certain number of yeses, nos, and no opinions, or 4s and 5s and 3s and 1s and 2s, you could definitely do the analysis. You need an engineer or a statistician to help with that if necessary, but it's definitely a valid methodology.
Okay, thank you. And we'll do one more question if that's okay. We had a lot of great questions. We're running out of time. I'll read this one. Can sample sizes for components in one kit piggyback from testing for the same component in a different kit? How can differences in the stress of different applications be quantified and applied? Those are sort of two different questions, but.
Yeah, I think I understand the nature of the question. And yes, historical data from similar components can be used, and it could be an input into your difference to detect. But you have to be very cautious in applying testing from one component to a component in another kit, because there's so many other factors involved regarding production equivalency and design equivalency. So we have to be very cautious doing that, and it's best practice to get the regulatory people involved if you're in the medical device industry and really confirm that we can show substantial equivalency and use test data for one component and apply it toward another. And also, individual products, the risk analysis might have a different severity rating for a failure for one product versus another. So using the correct specific risk analysis is of the utmost importance. For example, my company makes Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 medical devices, and obviously a failure of a Class 3 device, which is life-sustaining, is worse than a failure of a tongue depressor or something like that. So you really need to think through things.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Excellent presentation. We ask that our attendees complete a short survey that should be available after the webinar within your GoToWebinar. A recording of this webinar will also be available within a few days on our division's YouTube channel. That's available at youtube.com/ASQStatsDivision. Please be sure to share this webinar and other archived webinars with friends and coworkers and colleagues. Also, we encourage you to check out the division's LinkedIn page, as well as our events calendar, which can be viewed at asq.org/statistics. We have the latest news on our webinars and conferences and many other topics available there. That's all the time we have today. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you again, Scott, for presenting with the Statistics Division. Hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon and weekend.
Okay, thanks.